The stars above Elysium 4 had always been kind to the people who lived beneath them. It was a world built for the young, a garden planet where humanity had planted its deepest hopes and most fragile dreams, and every city on its surface had been designed with children in mind, with wide parks and open schools and playgrounds that stretched across green valleys under a pale blue sky. Nearly 2.5 million people called Elysium home, and almost 1 million of them were children. They came from every corner of human civilization, sent by parents who wanted them to grow up breathing clean air and learning without fear. And the colony had become something sacred to the species, a promise that no matter how far humanity spread into the cold darkness of space, it would never forget to nurture the next generation. That promise died on a Tuesday. The Valtari Dominion had been sending messages for months, cold transmissions written in the clipped, emotionless language of a species that viewed the galaxy as a machine to be optimized, and every message said the same thing in different words. Leave this world. It sits too close to our hyperspace corridor. Your presence here is inconvenient. Humanity's diplomats responded with patience and legal arguments, pointing to the Galactic Concord Charter that guaranteed their right to settle Elysium. And the Valthari listened the way a giant listens to an insect buzzing near its ear, with mild irritation and absolutely no respect. The Valthari were an ancient species, insectoid and cold, with a civilization that stretched back 12,000 years. And in all that time, they had never once considered a younger race to be worthy of genuine concern. And humans were the youngest of them all, barely 3 centuries into their starfaring age, small and soft and hopelessly emotional. When the final diplomatic message went unanswered, the Valthari did not send a warning. They did not issue a declaration of war. They simply arrived. 12 carrier-class warships dropped out of hyperspace above Elysium 4 at dawn. And before the colony's tiny defense satellites could even power up their sensors, the bombardment began. Kinetic rounds the size of buildings slammed into the surface, one after another, punching through the crust and sending shock waves that flattened entire cities in seconds. And then came the bioweapons, canisters that burst in the upper atmosphere and released clouds of engineered toxins that killed every living thing they touched. It took 6 hours. 6 hours to erase 2.5 million lives from the universe. The emergency channels recorded everything. The confused voices of teachers trying to calm their students, the screaming of parents who could see the sky turning black, the tiny broken voice of a girl no older than 7 calling for her mother over and over until the signal cut to silence. Those recordings would survive because a single comm relay on the far side of the planet managed to transmit a burst of data before the final impact turned it to dust. And that data would travel across the stars and reach Earth 3 days later, where it would be played in a sealed room deep beneath the Admiralty building in Geneva. Admiral Katya Sorin sat alone in that room and listened to every second of it. She was a tall woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen enough combat to strip away every unnecessary emotion. And she sat perfectly still in her chair as the voices of the dying washed over her. And she did not cry. She did not look away. She did not close her eyes. She simply listened the way a surgeon studies a wound before deciding where to cut. When the recordings ended, she requested the full casualty list. It arrived as a file so large it took her personal terminal 3 minutes to load. And when it opened, she saw names, thousands and thousands of names, arranged in neat columns, and next to each name was an age. So many of the numbers were small. 5, 7, 3, 11, 9, 2. She began to read. She read for 3 days without sleeping, without eating more than a few bites of cold bread, without speaking to anyone who knocked on her door. And she read every single name and every single age until the last entry on the list burned itself into her memory. When she finally stood up, her legs were stiff and her vision was blurred, but her hands were steady and her voice was clear, and she opened the door to find her senior staff waiting in the corridor, with hollow eyes and pale faces. She looked at them, one by one, and saw the same thing in each of their expressions. A grief so deep it had gone past tears and arrived at something harder, something with edges and weight, something that would not fade with time, but would instead grow sharper with every passing day. "Black Assembly," she said. The words meant nothing to most of the galaxy, but every person in that corridor understood them, and the color drained from their faces not from fear, but from the recognition that humanity had just crossed a line it could never uncross. The Galactic Concord released its official response 2 days later, a carefully worded statement expressing deep concern over the Elysium incident and calling for immediate dialogue between all parties. And it was the kind of statement that sounded important, but meant absolutely nothing, the diplomatic equivalent of a shrug. No sanctions were imposed on the Velthari. No fleet was mobilized. No elder race lifted a single finger to help. Behind closed doors, the reason was simple. The Velthari controlled too many trade routes and produced too many valuable resources, and humanity was too small and too weak to be worth defending. And the math of galactic politics had no column for the lives of children. Humanity noticed. Humanity would remember. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, in places that had been sealed and forgotten by everyone except those who were meant to remember, ancient systems began to wake. And in bunkers carved into the bones of the Ural Mountains, and buried under the Antarctic ice shelf, and hidden in the crushing darkness of the Marianas Trench, lights flickered on for the first time in centuries. These places had been built during humanity's darkest hours, when the species had nearly destroyed itself and had learned the hardest of all lessons, that peace is precious precisely because it is temporary, and that the only way to protect what you love is to prepare for the day when something tries to take it away. The machines in those bunkers began to hum, the weapons began to charge, and 942,000 dead children waited in silence for what came next. Every species that bothered to pay attention saw the same signs. Human trade ships pulling back to home systems, diplomatic channels going quiet, colony worlds turning inward and closing their ports, and the elder races nodded to themselves with the comfortable certainty of those who had seen this pattern 100 times before. A young species suffers a blow, the young species retreats and grieves, and eventually the young species accepts its place in the natural order and moves on, smaller and more obedient than before. The Velthari were so confident in this outcome that they had already begun surveying Elysium 4's orbit for their new hyperspace relay station, and their military commanders filed the entire operation under pest removal in their official records and moved on to other business. They could not have been more wrong. 3 months after the burning of Elysium, in a chamber buried so deep beneath the Swiss Alps that the rock above it was still, warm from the planet's core, 47 men and women sat around a black stone table that had no markings and no name. This was the Black Assembly. It had existed in one form or another for over 300 years, born in the aftermath of the last great war on Earth, that terrible century when humanity had come within a hair's width of wiping itself out completely, and the survivors had looked at the ashes of their civilization and made a vow that was carved into the wall of this very chamber in 12 languages. Never again will our children die unanswered. The assembly was not a government body, and it appeared in no official record, and its members were chosen not for their rank or their politics, but for their ability to think about the unthinkable, to plan for the scenarios that decent people prayed would never come, and to do so with a cold and terrible clarity that most humans could never sustain for long without breaking. Admiral Soren stood at the head of the table and activated Doctrine Obsidian. The name itself was old, older than spaceflight, and it referred to a simple idea, that humanity had two faces, one it showed to the world, and one it kept locked away in the dark, and that the second face was not a mask, but a mirror, a reflection of everything the species had learned in 10,000 years of doing horrible things to itself. The galaxy had only ever seen the first face, the smiling diplomats, the eager scientists, the slightly clumsy explorers who seemed so grateful for every scrap of technology the elder races tossed their way, and that face was real. It was not an act. Humanity genuinely wanted peace and cooperation and friendship with the stars. But the second face was also real, and it was so much older. The assembly began its briefings, and what emerged over the following hours would have terrified any species in the galaxy if they had been present to hear it, because it became clear that humanity had been preparing for this moment since the day it first left Earth. Every piece of technology shared by the elder races had been reverse-engineered and improved in secret laboratories hidden throughout human space. And the improvements were not small. The humans had not simply copied what they were given. They had studied it with the obsessive focus of a species that had spent its entire history turning tools into weapons. And they had found ways to make things more powerful and more precise and more devastating than their creators had ever imagined. The Velthari had gravity manipulation technology that they used for construction, and humanity had turned it into a weapon that could crush a warship like a fist closing around an egg. The Larathi had gifted humans with advanced sensor arrays as a gesture of goodwill, and humanity had inverted the technology to create stealth systems so effective that a ship could sit in the middle of an enemy fleet and remain completely invisible. The Concord species had shared their medical nanobots freely, and human bioweapon specialists had spent decades learning how to reprogram those same nanobots to do things their inventors would have nightmares about. But technology was not humanity's true advantage. Their true advantage was something far more ancient and far more dangerous. They understood fear, not as a concept or a biological response, but as an art form, a discipline that had been studied and refined and perfected across thousands of years of wars fought against the most creative and vicious enemy imaginable, themselves. No other species in the galaxy had humanity's depth of experience with psychological warfare, because no other species had spent millennia practicing it on their own kind, developing techniques so sophisticated that entire civilizations had crumbled not from military defeat, but from the sheer weight of terror pressed upon them. Activated divisions that most of humanity did not know existed. Specialists in propaganda and deception and psychological operations who had trained their entire lives for a conflict they hoped would never come. And these people were not monsters. They were teachers and researchers and quiet professionals who understood the architecture of the mind better than anyone alive. And they knew exactly how to take that architecture apart. Admiral Soren was given command of the Retribution Fleet, and when the shipyard doors opened to reveal it, even she, who had seen much in her long career, felt her breath catch. The ships were black, not painted, but coated in materials that bait light and returned nothing, and they carried no flags, and no insignia, and no names, and their hulls were shaped not for beauty, but for a single purpose that needed no explanation. In the Galactic Concord's capital station, a young Velthari diplomat named Sekthai was the first of his kind to sense that something was wrong, and it was not any single thing, but a pattern of small things that made the hairs on his forelimbs rise with unease. The human ambassadors had not changed their behavior in any obvious way, but there was something different in their eyes, a patience that felt less like calm and more like the stillness of a predator waiting for its prey to take one more step. He filed 17 separate warnings with his superiors, and every single one was dismissed with the same condescending response. They are mammals, they grieve with great noise, and then they accept. This is the way of young species. Do not concern yourself. Then the broadcast came. It arrived on every frequency, in every language, on every channel, across the entire galaxy simultaneously. And there was no video and no identification, just a voice, a woman's voice, steady and clear, and carrying the weight of something that most translation systems could not fully process. To the Velthari, Dominane, the voice said. You killed our children, and we want you to understand that we are not coming for your soldiers. We are not coming for your territory. We are coming for your ability to sleep at night. This is not a war. This is an education. Across 10,000 worlds, the translation AIs worked frantically to convert the message, and many of them failed. Not because the words were complex, but because the concept behind them had no equivalent in most alien languages. The Veltari had a word for conflict, and a word for defeat, and a word for death. But they had no word for what Katya Soren was describing. Humans did. They called it dread. They had conquered dozens of species across 12,000 years, and they knew how wars were fought. And when the human broadcast reached their command hives, they responded exactly as their training demanded, with swift and overwhelming force, arranged in the formations that had broken every enemy they had ever faced. 300 warships formed a defensive perimeter around their core systems, their weapons charged and their sensors sweeping every corner of space for the approaching human fleet. And ground forces numbering in the tens of millions were deployed to key worlds, with orders to dig in and hold at all costs. They outnumbered humanity 15-1 in ships and 200-1 in soldiers, and their technology was tested across millennia of conquest. And by every rational calculation, the coming war should have been over before it truly began. But the human fleet did not come. Days passed and then weeks, and the Velthari Armada sat in perfect formation, burning fuel and resources while scanning empty space. And the commanders grew restless, and their soldiers grew nervous, and the silence that stretched across the void became heavier with each passing hour. Then the messages started arriving. They came to individual Veltari commanders, not through military channels, but through personal communication devices that should have been completely secure. And each message contained a dossier, a file so detailed and so intimate that the commanders who received them felt something they had never experienced before. The files contained the names of their broodmates and the locations of their family hive clusters, and the schedules of their children's daily routines, and the medical records of their queen mothers. And there were photographs taken from angles that should have been impossible, images of private chambers and nursery pods and feeding halls that no outsider had ever seen. The messages contained no threats. They did not need to. The meaning was clear. We are already inside your world. We have been watching you. We know everything about you and everyone you love, and you never even noticed. Panic spread through the Velthari command structure like poison through a bloodstream, and admirals who had faced death without flinching suddenly found themselves unable to sleep, checking and rechecking the security systems around their family compounds, jumping at shadows that had never bothered them before. And then the ghost ships appeared. Velthari sensor operators on the fortress world of Kethvar reported a contact inside their defense perimeter. A single vessel, sitting motionless in space, less than 1,000 kilometers from their orbital stations. And when they focused their scanners on it, they saw a ship of human design, black and featureless, making no attempt to hide. Defense batteries locked on and prepared to fire, but before the order could be given, the ship simply vanished. Not jumping to hyperspace, not accelerating away, just gone, as if it had never existed. The next day it appeared inside the atmosphere of Velthara Prime itself, hovering silently above the capital hive for 11 minutes, while every weapon on the planet tried and failed to get a targeting lock. And then it was gone again. It happened on world after world, the black ships appearing in impossible places, inside defense grids and above command centers, and once directly beside the personal shuttle of a Velthari Supreme Commander, while he was traveling between systems. And every time the ships did nothing. They simply existed in places they should not have been able to reach, and then disappeared. The Velthari military began to fracture from within, not from casualties, but from the corrosive effect of constant uncertainty. And soldiers who had been bred for loyalty and obedience started questioning their commanders, and their commanders started questioning their intelligence services, and their intelligence services started questioning reality itself. The second phase began without announcement. Supply convoys arriving at Velthari military worlds began to carry cargo that was subtly wrong, nutrient paste that tasted slightly different, fuel cells that performed 3% below specification, medical supplies that were just barely off formula, and none of it was dangerous enough to trigger automated safety checks, but all of it was wrong enough to notice. Paranoia became a disease that infected every level of Velthari society, and every meal became a test of courage, and every piece of equipment became a potential trap, and productivity across the entire Dominion dropped by 40%, as workers and soldiers spent more time checking and double-checking their supplies than actually using them. Then humanity struck at the very heart of what made the Velthari function as a species. Insectoid races of the galaxy depended on pheromone-based communication for their deepest social bonds, chemical signals that established trust and hierarchy and loyalty at a level far below conscious thought. And these pheromones were the invisible glue that held the entire Velthari civilization together. Human biochemists had spent decades studying these systems, and they had developed something elegant and horrible. An aerosol compound that disrupted the trust pheromones, replacing them with signals that triggered threat responses. And when this compound was released into the ventilation systems of Velthari military installations, the effects were immediate and catastrophic. Soldiers who had served together for years suddenly perceived their own officers as enemies, and officers perceived their subordinates as traitors, and entire garrisons tore themselves apart in frenzies of violence that lasted hours, and left the survivors so traumatized that they could not function. A single human soldier had set foot on Velthari soil. Not a single human weapon had been fired. The young diplomat Sekthai watched his civilization begin to crack from his post at the Concord station. And he did something that no Velthari diplomat had ever done in 12,000 years of galactic politics. He begged. He went before the Concord Council and described what was happening, and pleaded for intervention. And the elder races listened with expressions that ranged from discomfort to genuine fear. But none of them moved to help, because none of them wanted to draw humanity's attention to themselves. After the session, a representative of the Lorathi, one of the oldest species in the galaxy, found Sekthai alone in a corridor, and spoke to him in a voice heavy with something that sounded like pity. "You do not understand what you have woken," the Lorathi said. "We have studied their historical records, and what they are doing to you now, they did to each other for thousands of years. And you must understand, young one, that what you are experiencing is not their worst. This is them being restrained. They did worse things to themselves, and they were merely practicing." Sekthai could not speak. The first true battle came at the Velcora Nexus, a massive shipyard complex that produced a third of the Velthari war fleet. And the Retribution fleet arrived not in silence, but broadcasting something far worse than any weapon: sound. The emergency channel recordings from Elysium's final hours filled every Velthari communication frequency. The voices of teachers and parents and children, the screaming and the crying, and the terrible quiet that came after. And the Veltari crews who heard it were so disoriented by the raw alien emotion in those sounds that many of them simply froze at their stations. Then the black ships attacked. There were no battle cries, and no demands for surrender, and no grand speeches, just precise and merciless violence, delivered with the cold efficiency of a species that had perfected the art of killing long before it ever reached the stars. And the Nexus burned. Admiral Soren watched the shipyard come apart on her tactical display, and an aide standing nearby asked her quietly if she felt anything. She did not look away from the screen. "I feel 942,000 reasons to continue," she said. The Galactic Concord received an urgent transmission the following day, and every species that saw it felt something shift in the foundations of the galaxy, because it was a formal request for military assistance from the Velthari Dominion, the first such request in their entire 12,000-year history. The elder races finally began to understand. This was not a war. Humanity was not trying to win territory or resources or political concessions. They were trying to make an example so terrible that no species in the galaxy would ever consider touching a human child again. And they were just getting started. 6 months after the death of Elysium, the Veltari Dominion was a civilization learning what it meant to be afraid. Their fleets still flew, and their soldiers still stood at their posts, and their queen mothers still laid their eggs in the deep, warm chambers of their hive worlds. But something fundamental had changed in the species. Something that could not be repaired with weapons or walls, because the enemy had found a way inside their minds, and no amount of armor could keep it out. Humanity had begun broadcasting. Not threats, and not propaganda in the way the galaxy understood it, but something far more unsettling. History, their own history, translated into every Veltari dialect, and transmitted on frequencies that could not be blocked. And the content of these broadcasts was the most disturbing thing any alien species had ever received from another civilization. They told the Veltari about Stalingrad, about a city where humans fought each other, room by room and floor by floor in frozen ruins, while millions starved around them, killing each other with bullets and bayonets and bare hands for months that stretched into what must have seemed like eternity. They told them about the firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo, about how humans had deliberately set fire to their own kind cities, creating storms of flames so intense that the air itself burned, and people were reduced to shadows on the pavement. They told them about Hiroshima, about a weapon so terrible that its creators wept when they saw what it could do. A weapon that turned a city of 300,000 people into ash and light in a single heartbeat. And they told them that after using this weapon, humanity did not stop building more, but instead built thousands of them, enough to destroy their own world several times over. They told them about the trenches of the First World War, about men sitting in mud and poison gas for years, while machine guns turned every charge into a harvest of the dead, about a generation of young men fed into a grinding machine of steel and fire, for reasons that none of them fully understood. The message beneath these histories was never spoken directly, but it was understood by every Velthari who heard them. This is what we did to people who shared our blood and our world and our language. This is what we were willing to do to our own brothers and sisters and children. And if we could do this to those we loved, then you cannot begin to imagine what we are prepared to do to you. The effect was devastating. Velthari queen mothers, the reproductive and spiritual heart of every hive cluster, began to break from the Dominion. Entire regions of Velthari space going silent, as local leaders decided that whatever punishment the Dominion might impose for disloyalty was preferable to remaining a target of whatever humanity was building toward. And for the first time in recorded history, the great hive civilization that had stood unified for 12,000 years began to splinter. Sekthai worked desperately through back channels and unofficial contacts to arrange what no one believed was possible. a face-to-face meeting between himself and Admiral Soren. It happened on a neutral station in unclaimed space, a small trading post that had been emptied for the occasion, and Sekthai arrived with a security detail of 20 soldiers, while Soren came alone. She was smaller than he had expected, this human female who had become the most feared being in the galaxy, and there was nothing in her appearance that suggested the architect of a campaign that had brought the mightiest military civilization in known space to its knees. She looked tired and thin, and her gray hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and her uniform was plain. But her eyes were the eyes of someone who had walked through fire and decided that the burning was useful, had prepared speeches and arguments and carefully reasoned appeals to mercy. But when he stood before her, all of that fell away, and he simply asked for terms, his voice carrying the harmonic tremor that indicated deep distress in his species. Soren studied him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was not angry and not cruel, but carried a weight that pressed against his chest like a physical force. "I want to ask you something," she said. "When your commanders gave the order to burn Elysium, did they think about the nurseries? Did they consider even for one moment that there were rooms full of sleeping children on the surface of that world? Did the thought cross their minds at all?" Sekthai opened his mandibles to respond, and found that he could not. Because he knew the answer, and the answer was no. They had not thought about it. Children had not entered the calculation at any point, because human children were simply not a category that Velthari military planners considered worthy of consideration. Soren saw the truth in his silence, and she nodded slowly. "That is why this is not over," she said. "Not because we want revenge. Revenge is simple and stupid, and we are neither. It is not over because you need to learn something that your species has never had to learn, and we are going to teach it to you, and the lesson is going to hurt." Back in the core of human space, the Galactic Concord made its move at last, not to help the Veltari, but to contain the thing that humanity was becoming, and a combined fleet of Elder Race warships, the largest military force assembled in 3,000 years, moved to blockade human space and demand a ceasefire. Admiral Soren's response was a single data transmission sent simultaneously to every flagship in the blockade fleet. And when the Elder Race commanders opened it, they found technical specifications, detailed blueprints, and performance data for weapons that humanity had built, but had not yet deployed, weapons that could fracture moons, weapons that could destabilize the fusion process at the heart of a star, weapons that could tear apart the subspace corridors that connected every civilization in the galaxy, reducing 10,000 years of interstellar society to isolated islands of light in an ocean of unreachable darkness. The accompanying message was 3 sentences long. "We built these because we knew this day might come. We have not used them because we are not monsters. Please do not make us reconsider that position." The blockade fleet withdrew within the hour, and not a single Elder Race commander filed an objection. Within humanity itself, the war had opened a wound that would not stop bleeding, and not everyone supported what was being done in their name. Dr. Emil Vasquez had lost his 9-year-old daughter on Elysium, a bright-eyed girl named Sophia, who had loved painting and had dreamed of being the first human to Mars. Befriend a Veltari child, and his grief was a living thing that gnawed at him every waking moment. But it had not made him cruel. It had made him terrified that cruelty was consuming the species he loved. He confronted Soren in her quarters aboard the flagship, pushing past her guards with the desperate energy of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Katya," he said, using her first name because they had known each other for 20 years. "When does this end? When is it enough? Because I am watching us become something that my daughter would not recognize, and I need to know that there is a line we will not cross." Soren looked at him, and for just a moment, the iron mask she wore cracked, and he saw the exhaustion and the sorrow underneath. "It ends," she said quietly, "when they are more afraid of hurting a human child than they are of dying." Then came the lullaby. It was the culmination of everything humanity's psychological warfare divisions had been building toward, a signal broadcast across all Valthari military frequencies that combined synthetic pheromone triggers with carefully engineered audio patterns. And what it did was so precisely targeted that it bordered on artistry. It did not kill. It did not cause pain. It reached into the deepest neurochemical pathways of the Valthari brain and activated the response that a queen mother feels when her brood has been destroyed, the most profound grief that the insectoid species was capable of experiencing. A loss so total that it shut down every other function and left nothing but an abyss of sorrow. Millions of Valthari soldiers across dozens of worlds heard the lullaby and collapsed where they stood, curling into themselves and keening with a sound that their species had never made in such numbers. A sound of parents mourning children that they had not lost, but that their bodies and minds believed, with absolute certainty, were gone. Installations fell silent, as entire armies lay weeping on the ground, unable to move or speak or think about anything except the unbearable weight of dead children. Children who were not theirs. But the feeling was real. On the bridge of her flagship, Admiral Katya Sorin watched the reports scroll across her display. World after world going quiet as the lullaby did its work. And she saw the numbers, and she understood that in this moment, millions of Veltari were feeling exactly what she had felt when she read those 942,000 names. She turned away from the display and walked to the observation window and stood there, looking out at the stars, and for the first time since Elysium, she allowed herself to cry. Not from satisfaction, not from triumph, from recognition. "Now you know," she whispered to the silent glass. "Now you finally know." The message arrived 12 hours later on a frequency reserved for the most urgent communications in the Veltari Dominion. An unconditional ceasefire broadcast, not by a military commander or a political leader, but by the Supreme Hive itself, the collective voice of every Queen Mother on Valtara Prime. And it was addressed not to Earth's government or to the human military, but to one person. "Mother of the dead," the message read. "We hear them now. Please stop." The silence that followed the ceasefire was the loudest thing the galaxy had ever heard. Every species on every world, in every corner of known space, held its breath and waited to see what humanity would do next, whether the darkness they had unleashed would consume them entirely, or whether something else would emerge from the wreckage of what had been done and what had been done in return. The Valthari waited in their hives with the numb stillness of a species that had discovered for the first time in 12,000 years what it meant to be small, and their soldiers lay in their barracks, still trembling from the echo of the lullaby. And their queen mothers held their eggs close and sang to them in low frequencies that roughly translated to a promise. Never again, never again, never again. Admiral Katya Sorin had not slept in 4 days when she sat down at the negotiating table on the neutral station of Korath 7, and across from her sat the Velthari delegation, led by Sekthai, who had aged visibly in the months since their first meeting, his carapace dulled and his movements carrying the careful slowness of someone who has learned that the universe is larger and more dangerous than he ever imagined. The galaxy expected humanity to take everything. That was what conquerors did. That was the pattern written across 10,000 years of galactic history, and by every measure, humanity had earned the right to demand whatever it wanted. Territory and resources and tribute and the total submission of a civilization that had murdered its children. Humanity asked for none of those things. The Treaty of Elysium's memory contained only 3 provisions, and when they were made public, the galaxy did not know what to make of them, because they fit no pattern that any elder race had ever seen. The first provision required the Veltari to build a permanent memorial on the surface of Velthara Prime, their own homeworld. Memorial would contain the name of every child killed on Elysium, carved into stone that would last for millennia. And the Veltari would maintain it themselves, and they would keep it clean, and they would ensure that it stood for as long as their civilization endured. 942,000 names in human script on the surface of an alien world, where every Veltari who passed by would see them and remember. The second provision established the Cradle Accords, a new galactic law stating that the deliberate targeting of children by any species for any reason would be considered an act so grave that it would trigger an automatic and collective military response from all signatory nations, not optional and not subject to debate, and not weakened by economic considerations or political convenience. Humanity presented this provision not as a request, but as a condition for the continued existence of the Galactic Concord itself. Soren simply looked at them and said nothing, and one by one they signed. The third provision was the one that broke Sekthai. Humanity required the Veltari to teach their young the truth about what had happened, not a sanitized version and not a political interpretation, but the raw and complete truth, that the Veltari had killed nearly 1 million children because they considered them inconvenient, and that humanity had responded by dismantling the most powerful military civilization in the galaxy without mercy, and that the Veltari had felt through the lullaby exactly the grief that their actions had caused. Every generation, forever. So that no Veltari would ever be born who did not understand in the deepest part of their being why what happened on Elysium must never happen again. Sekthai signed the treaty with trembling forelimbs, and when it was done, he looked at Soren and asked the question that had been haunting him since their first meeting. Exalo has. You had the power, and you had the right, and no one in the galaxy would have stopped you. So why show mercy to a species that showed none to your children? Soren was quiet for a long time. Because destruction teaches nothing, she said at last. Dead species do not remember. Dead civilizations do not change. And if we destroyed you, then 1,000 years from now, some other species would look at a human colony and think the same thing your commanders thought. That our children do not matter, and we would have to do this all over again. She leaned forward, and her eyes held his with an intensity that made him want to look away, but could not. We do not want to do this again, she said, so you will remember for us, and your children will remember, and their children after them, and the memory will protect every child in this galaxy long after you and I are dust. In the months that followed, the galaxy rearranged itself around the new reality that humanity had created. The Galactic Concord was fundamentally transformed because the elder races who had spent millennia looking down on humans now looked at them with something that was not quite respect and not quite fear, but a mixture of both that had no name in any alien language, and one by one they adjusted their behavior and their policies and their attitudes in ways both large and small. A Lorathi philosopher named Kethvoron published an essay that spread across every world in known space, and became the most widely read document in galactic history, and its central passage would be quoted for centuries to come. Humanity is the only species that domesticated its own darkness, Kethvoron wrote. They did not eliminate cruelty from their nature because they understood that this was impossible, and instead they leashed it and trained it and taught it to sit quietly in the corner until it was called, and the galaxy made the mistake of thinking that because the beast was quiet, it did not exist. But it was always there, waiting, and it remembers everything. Admiral Katya Soren retired from service on a cold morning in November, and she left the Admiralty building in Geneva without ceremony or fanfare, walking alone through streets where people stopped and stared, and did not know whether to salute or weep. She went home to a small house in the mountains, and she sat in the garden, and she was quiet for a very long time. Then she made a phone call. 6 months later, she opened a school. And it was not a military academy or a training facility, but a home for children who had lost everything. And it was not only for human children, but for the orphans of every species affected by the war, including Veltari broodlings whose hive clusters had shattered in the chaos of the Dominion's collapse. When journalists asked her how she could care for the children of the species that had murdered her own people's young, she looked at them with those steady gray eyes and gave an answer that silenced the room. The point was never to make them suffer forever, she said. The point was to make sure that no one ever forgets why they should never do it again. And the best way to make sure of that is to raise their children alongside ours so that they grow up knowing each other as people and not as enemies. Dr. Emil Vasquez visited the school often, and he brought with him a painting that his daughter Sophia had made before she died. A simple watercolor of a blue sky with 2 suns, which was what Elysium sky had looked like on a clear day, and he hung it in the main hallway where every child who entered would see it. He also published a book that became required reading at every university in the Concord, a treatise called The Architecture of Human Fury that attempted to explain to alien species what had happened and why. And its central thesis was both simple and profound, that humanity's greatest strength and greatest danger were the same thing, that they felt everything with a depth and intensity that no other species could match, and that their love and their wrath flowed from the same source, like 2 rivers fed by the same mountain. To threaten what a human loves, Vasquez wrote, is to open a door that should never be opened, because behind that door is every terrible thing they have ever done, and every terrible thing they have ever survived, and all of it will come for you, and it will not stop until it has made you understand exactly what you have taken from them. Sektai became the first permanent Velthari ambassador to humanity, and he took his role with a seriousness that bordered on sacred devotion, spending years learning human languages and human customs and human history, until he understood them better than most humans understood themselves. He visited the ruins of Elysium 4 once, traveling with Dr. Vasquez to the surface of the dead world, where ash still covered the ground like gray snow, and they walked together through what had once been a schoolyard, their feet crunching on debris that might have been concrete or might have been bone, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Sektai turned to Vasquez and asked a question that had haunted him since the day of the lullaby. "How do you carry this?" he said. "This grief that never fades. How do you hold it inside you and still function, still build, still love? How do you not simply collapse under the weight of it?" Vasquez looked at the ash beneath his feet, and then at the sky above, which was still and empty, and would never again hear the sound of children laughing. "We do not carry it," he said, and there was a gentle sadness in his voice that Sektai had come to recognize as one of humanity's most characteristic traits, the ability to be broken and whole at the same time. We build with it. Years passed. On a world orbiting a young star near the old Elysium system, a new colony was taking shape. And this time, it was not just humans doing the building. Velthari engineers worked alongside human construction crews, their precise insectoid limbs assembling structures, while human workers welded and wired and painted, and the sound of 2 languages mixing in the morning air had become as natural as birdsong. A school stood at the center of the colony, half finished but already alive with the sound of voices, and outside its walls, a human girl of about 8, with red hair and scraped knees, was chasing a Velthari broodling through a field of tall amber grass, both of them shrieking with the universal sound of children at play, a sound that transcended species and language and history. A Concord observer stationed on the colony watched them from a distance and recorded what he saw. And that evening, he sat down and composed his report to the elder races. That would be filed in the great archives and read by generations of galactic leaders for centuries to come. He described the colony and its construction and its population and its economic projections. But in the final paragraph, he set aside the language of bureaucracy and wrote something that came from a place deeper than duty. Recommendation to Concord High Council, he wrote, do not provoke humanity, not because they will destroy you, for destruction is the simplest thing they are capable of, and they reserve it for those who deserve nothing better. But because they will do something far worse than destroy you. They will make you understand exactly what you have done, and they will make you feel it in the deepest part of your being, and then you will have to live with that understanding for the rest of your existence. He paused and looked out the window at the two children playing in the amber light of the alien sunset, the human girl and the Velthari broodling, tumbling together in the grass without a care in the universe, and he added one final line. There is no species in this galaxy more dangerous than one that has mastered the art of making monsters feel grief, and there is no species more worthy of respect than one that, having mastered that art, chooses to build schools instead of monuments to its own power. Outside, the children played on, their laughter rising into the evening sky like a promise, like a warning, like the sound of a future that 942,000 children had paid for with everything they had. The stars watched in silence. They had learned to pay attention.